Hi everyone, this is your podcast host Ramasha, and I'm in my final semester studying Master of International Business at Monash University, Malaysia. And today we are here with our guest, Professor Maude Phipps. Hi Professor Maude.
Hi Ramasha, happy to be here.
Yes, same here, Professor. Let me do a quick introduction for Professor Maude for those of you who may not know who she is. Professor Maude Phipps is a professor of human genetics at the Jeffrey Chia School of Medicine and Health Sciences at Monash University, Malaysia. She currently teaches genetics and medical ethics. Her research is in human population genetics and health with special focus on addressing the large gaps in scientific knowledge with regards to indigenous communities and populations in Southeast Asia. A firm believer in research-led teaching, she has woven her research contributions and latest findings into biomedical teaching programs. Professor Maude was also a found member of the Women's Empowerment Network and continues to mentor early career researchers and colleagues in the university and region. Let me quickly mention one of her publications that she has also put out. This is one of her articles that I'll be mentioning, and it is titled Engaging Malaysian Indigenous Communities to Participate in Human Genomics and Health Research. Alright, moving on to the questions for you today, Professor. First, I would like to ask you, what is the main theme of your research with the Malaysian indigenous community in the past 20 years?
Hi, I have been really fascinated by this area of not only research but also engagement. And because Malaysia, as you know, is rather unique, right? So we have West Malaysia and East Malaysia, which is on Borneo. We have our community of mixed races with different religions and some even who practice animistic beliefs. So in 2003, a student of mine at the UM at the time, biomedical student whose name is Tim Jinam, wanted to do a project with me. And those days I supervised honors projects and also masters and so on. And at the time I was invited to actually be part of the Pan-Asia Single Nucleotide Polymorphism or SNP initiative. And I was quite excited about this. And that was, this is now 2023 and we're talking about 2003. Because the idea behind this was that Asian scientists needed to band together to actually do something that was quite unique to this part of the world. So as a population geneticist or a medical geneticist in my earlier incarnation, there are a lot of databases, things like the Human Genome Project, maybe that you all have heard about, and all sorts of other very large projects where the work and all the data is largely from westernized communities, Caucasian communities. And here we are in Asia, being the largest population in the world, if you consider Asian countries, and there was very little information about our genomes and how Asian communities, had their genetic history. How did they migrate? Was it out of Africa? Or was it that Homo sapiens arose elsewhere? And then, which at the time was still a theory, that there are other places where Homo sapiens evolved independently. So it seemed a good idea to get involved in that research, and my student was actually enrolled for his master's, which he did on that project. So that's when it started my work, and I realized, of course, I'm Eurasian, so I'm line in Malaysia, although I don't believe we should categorize based on religions or races or ethnicity. We're all Malaysians at heart. But it was a realization that we needed to do things for ourselves. And we also needed to make sure that we reduced what we termed parachute research. So when I say we, it means the scientists and the geneticists, anthropologists in 10 different countries in Asia that were part of this initiative. And parachute research being Obviously, people from foreign lands who come to a particular country parachute themselves down, do the research, get the resources, and get out of the country with no benefits at all to the community. So we realized this at very high levels at the time and decided, well, we've got to do something. And that's what led me on this journey.
Wow, it's very interesting, like the journey that you just mentioned, like from starting from 2003 and then now we are here in 2023. So it's like a long journey.
Like just yesterday.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Professor, why did you choose this area of research and engagement? What motivates you, and were there any triggering events?
I guess, it's part of my growth as a human geneticist and also a person who is passionate about bioethics, and in particular, a respect. And, when one is in the laboratory, as I was in the early days, when I was working on cancer genetics, my PhD, microbial genetics earlier on, it is very easy to have a detachment from the subjects you're working with. It's easy to look in a petri dish. It's easy to look at hundreds of samples, and there is a depersonalization in the laboratory. When you just work in a lab and you get samples, there is, of course, you don't say Mr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so. It is sample ABC, 1, 2, 3. And that gives a big barrier between the science you do and relating it to the community. And in human genetics particularly, we work with human samples. So each sample is a person, actually. And if you think of DNA, this is the blueprint of the person as a biological organism. So I think at some point of time, it struck me that what I'm holding in my hand is not just a sample. This is a person. And therefore, my attitudes changed tremendously. And I found that this area was also unique in the sense that this is a niche area. At the time, there were not many population geneticists. We don't get very well funded because unlike cancer research or cardiovascular research in the medical field where there's a lot of industrial money and you can see possible products at the end of it, these products are more knowledge. Although there are also potential applications, and we know that, you see. But at the time, it was still early days for that. And so my student inspired me because he was a Sarawakian. He is a Sarawakian, Tim, and he's now in UNIMAS. He's qualified and he lectures there. And we want to continue to do work together. Another source of inspiration was when I read the books published by Dr. Adela Bear. And Adela Bear was an American physician, and she was very interested in our Orang Asli, who are, of course, the indigenous people of Peninsular Malaysia. In terms of numbers, they are the minorities, only 0.5 to 0.6% of our total population, which is now, I think, 30 over million. So it was a unique angle also to look at. And because I was not an anthropologist, I cannot pretend to be an anthropologist, it was so important to work with people who were part of the community. And I was very fortunate to have met Dr. Julie Edo at the time. In fact, initially I thought it was a woman, having my biases, but Julie Edo turned out to be a marvelous collaborator. He was an anthropologist who was semi-Orang Asli, who was trained at an Australian National University for his PhD, one of the first, I would think. And he was at UM's Faculty of Economics and Department of Anthropology at the time, So it was a partnership that we struck. And of course, it was also tied in with my colleagues at the medical school, where we could provide benefits sharing with the communities that we worked with.
Looking at your viewpoints of thinking this is not just a sample, but it is a human. Obviously, at that point, I don't think people would think in that way, but hearing your kind of journey, Professor, it's very interesting, and seeing what type of individuals kind of motivated you to do this research is also very interesting to hear. Moving on, what are the major challenges that you face when engaging and doing research with Indigenous communities?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think this is something that a lot of people who are not in the field don't really realize and may think it's a simple thing. But in fact, the process of engagement of these communities is very important process, because without these communities you don't get to do the research, right? So what my fellow population geneticists who work with these communities worldwide do, and we have some best practices, some of which are unique to Malaysia because our cultural differences and the populations and what they value as being important, is respect. And in Malaysia, I think because of the different cultural norms of these different communities, the Orang Asli and the Orang Asal in Sabah and Sarawak, it is a approach where we have to actually plan the project. We have to get permission from the Jabatan Kemajuan Orang Asli Malaysia. In the old days, it used to be called Jabatan Hal Ehwal Orang Asli Affairs Department. Now it's Orang Asli Development Department. So that's a government department in Peninsular Malaysia that actually is entrusted to look after Orang Asli welfare. And any research that is done with these communities needs their approval, right? So one is we've got to train my students as well and the staff to actually have a certain type of practices where we initially make the initial visits. So we have worked with communities as far as Belom Rainforest in the north with the Jehai communities, and as south as the people in Johor Bahru, Orang Seletar, and people also in the middle of Malaysia. So our research has covered many different groups of Orang Asli. So apart from the JACOA approval, where we have to be quite specific, we may have to get things like approval when we go into territories that are considered dark areas during the communist time. And this approval needs to come from Perhilitan, which is the Department of Forestry, and also the army and the police. Because in the north, in the old days, there actually were communists, right, before independence. And we know about these communists, and there were the resistance, and there were forces, and therefore land mines were planted. And these are still restricted areas, right? So it is, in a way, we try, of course, we don't go to these restricted areas, but still the authorities need to know that we're in there. So it carries some element of risk in some areas. In Johor, it's not bad. This is more urbanized, and therefore there is no necessity to have these particular types of approvals, right? So we've got to have the official approvals, and we also make visits, initial visits or courtesy visits to these communities wherever they are, because, as I've said earlier, this is research with the community. It's never on somebody or on a community, right? So it has to be a give and take. And we ask them during our initial visits, which take time to plan and travel to, when would be the best time for us to visit you? Okay, so that is, again, something that's going to be time consuming. You can't just go there with your research materials and expect immediately to be starting collecting samples and doing all sorts of things. So there is always an initial conversation. There is always a discussion with the chieftain. In the peninsula, most Orang Asli communities call their chief or the penghulu the batin, and the elders. Before we actually go and do the sampling or the biomedical testing or whatever it is. And we also ask them, what is it you need? Right? This is a two-way, this is benefits sharing. This is not assuming that one group has the same needs as another group. This is not assuming you just pay them 50 ringgit and that's it. You know? So some communities, for example, and that's why it takes long. These engagements, by the time we can actually do the research. I'd like to share some of our experiences in the north when we asked these communities what they would want, and they didn't actually want money, right? What they wanted was rice and salt and sugar, which they would have to spend time to get out of the rural area on the forest fringe on a boat, and then after 2 hours boat ride, they'll come to the town and then buy and then go back, right? So these were the things that they requested, which we brought. So in the past, when we were doing some of the research, we had to go with boats that were filled with bags of rice and hundreds of kilos of rice and sugar and salt to meet their needs. Because if you gave them money, it's going to be hard for them to spend the money, which they actually prefer food, right? So, and given the deforestation that has happened over the years and changes in the climate and environment, their needs also have changed. So we adapt to what these communities would like, rather than imposing what we think from maybe a researcher's perspective or a Western perspective, what is the right thing to do. It's a communication. Yeah.
Right. I think it's very interesting. I would like to highlight the main point that you meant, like researching with the community and not on. So basically you gave them like the prioritization of, understanding and also communicating with them the kind of needs that they would want. And obviously it's interesting to know that they requested like food, which like any of us, it's like a simple thing for us, but basic
for
thing.
most people.
Yes.
In urban areas or even in small towns, lots of things we take for granted, but it's very hard for them to get access now. So
Yes.
it's a different experience altogether.
Yes,
Yeah.
them traveling just like few hours just to get food is
Absolutely, and they don't plant very much now, and sometimes the weather can be quite unpredictable, so the crops might not work, right?
Yes.
So basic things that we feel if we can make a difference, we will bring there.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, Professor. So moving on, maybe Professor, could you please share some of your key findings over the years?
Right. So, if we look at the work that has involved population genetics in terms of Orang Asli, we have actually published quite a number of papers over the years, and I've done so mainly in collaboration with the scientists in Malaysia, such as Professor Ho Boon Peng, at the time who was in UiTM, Professor Zulfalil Alwi, who is now in USM, and a few other contemporaries of mine, including Professor Vijay Kumar from University Malaysia Sabah, right? So a lot of the work we do is in collaboration, because if you want to publish in a good journal, one small publication will not get you there, right? And because we think that collectively we are strong, each of us brings our different strengths to the project. Right. So starting with the publication we had, and when we started this work in 2004 onwards, it was a paper that we published in the journal Science, which was looking at the genomic history of Asia. And this was a seminal paper, and as I mentioned, that group, that initiative, that showed us for the first time that if we looked at 70 overpopulations in this part of the world, from India right down to Korea and Japan and Malaysia and Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, and so on, we would find that was a single migration out of Africa of our ancestors. Right. So that time it was a interesting and significant finding, I think, and it showed that the migration may have taken place maybe about 120,000 years ago. Those dates are still very foggy, right? But we have some estimates: 120,000, maybe 100,000 years ago, and it only takes really not that many people to come out of Africa, and the estimates that we have put to populate the world would be maybe about 10,000 only at the time to give us the current population of 8 billion. Right. So we're talking about ancestral groups of Homo sapiens, of humans, migrating out of Africa, and the ones towards Asia seem to have migrated along the coast of the Indian subcontinent. So they came out, so if you can imagine walking out of Africa, and they walk and they swam and they did all sorts of things to move. There's wanderlust built in the humans for all sorts of reasons, right? And from the coast of India, then they came into mainland Southeast Asia. And from there, they actually further migrated northwards to North, China, Japan, and so on. These are, I'm talking about ancestral groups, right? And then southwards, and then also eastwards. So Southeast Asia was a very, very important place for Homo sapien migration subsequently. So those are the old migrations out of Africa, if you like, right? Of course, there are some people that completely don't agree, but we are quite convinced this seems to be what it is, right? Now, the second type of work that we did, also in collaboration with people in Japan and people in Germany, the Max Planck, Professor Mark Stoneking at the time, Professor Saito Nariya at the National Institute of Genomics and Genetics in Japan, and other collaborators, and Tim Geenam's work, was that we actually looked at mitochondrial DNA. All right. So mitochondria is a organelle that is a powerhouse of a cell. And mitochondria is only passed from mother to offspring. All of us, regardless of male or female, have mitochondria from mother. So with mitochondrial DNA, which is very small, it's quite easy to work with in a sense, we can actually track maternal inheritance, and we can also track time frame. Because it's a small piece of DNA, and the experts can actually look at time frames for mitochondria to change from one type to another. So with mitochondria, it gives you the story of our mothers, right? And with this particular work that we did in 2012, I think, we actually looked at timing of some of our indigenous communities. And we found that some of the timings of these communities by the mitochondrial type, okay, indicated that there were subsequent waves of migration between 10,000 to 12,000 years ago as well in this region. And we have called it our early train hypothesis. So we've hypothesized, based on the evidence in this region, that it was populated by people and the mitochondrial DNA changed form 10 to 12,000 years ago. And subsequently, there was another migration that explained some people trying to understand the spread of language. So Bahasa Malaysia, for example, is an Austronesian language. Right? So we have languages that go with communities. And in this part of the world, in Asia, we have many old world languages, right? So we can trace the languages spoken in Malaysia, in island Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and so on, and in Sarawak, like Iban and the Philippines, to belonging to Austronesian. And that Austronesian language, a lot of people has hypothesized, spread from the island of Taiwan. Because in Taiwan, that is old days, you call it Formosa, they call it Formosa. You had the hill tribes, like the Ami and the Atayal, and they had these languages. So with that work, it sort of reconciled three different migrations and three different time frames. One that happened earlier that we published, one which was the early train, and the other was the out of Taiwan, the spread of the Austronesian languages. So it gives us a flavor of what happened and approximate time frame, right? So that was, I think, second seminal step in understanding. And besides that, we actually built a database. So we have that, which was publicly available, a database of the Pan-Asian Project, where we made available data from 50,000 SNPs for the worldwide community to use for their research. Okay, so that was something that we wanted to do in the first place. We felt that, you shouldn't be paying so much money to databases to get the info. We should be sharing this openly, with a caveat that if it is commercialized, or at the time we did not think of commercialization at all, because this was about the people, this was about sharing knowledge. And if you commercialize, I feel you're duty bound to share benefits and not just take people for granted, take samples for granted, right? That to me is a very imbalanced type of research that is done. Nevertheless, So the third thing that I think we did that further informed the story of population genetics was that we actually did work that had an analysis of ancient human remains. So as we moved along, as science moves along, as communities move along, things are unearthed and discovered. Right? So we had discovered, or rather scientists and paleontologists and archaeologists had actually discovered ancient human remains in Southeast Asia that were earlier not amenable to discovery or analysis. So we embarked upon another project to actually look at current populations and DNA from ancient skeletons and bones. And in Malaysia, we have a site called Gua Cha. Here is an archaeological site where we could get this DNA to analyze. And that also gave us a paper, and this was a paper in Science that documented how the populations came here and settled, which ones were hunter-gatherers, and it gave more definition to our understanding of how different populations were in different parts of the world. So this is a prehistory, going back to prehistory, rather than just looking at current populations. So it's a journey. Earlier on, I also collaborated with scientists in Australia, Griffith University, and the people in Cambridge University and Copenhagen to look at the prehistory of Aboriginal Australia as well, because the Aboriginal Australian groups also were the result of migrations that had happened into the Australian continent. So that was also another paper that was, quite well received, and it provides some illumination about the story of the human journey. So currently I am pursuing a different type of research and engagement, but maybe we can talk about that later.
Yes, it's very fascinating to know what the journey was from humans and understanding it from a very small cell, as you mentioned, and how you collaborated with all of these professors and everyone. It's very fascinating to know the journey, which I personally did not know.
Yeah, all of us were quite fascinated.
Yes.
I mean, sometimes the Malay say shock sendiri, but it was fun, and if it helps at all with human understanding of cultures, and I think it's a good thing. Another thing I'd like to mention, which probably I should, was we also do biomedical research, okay? So with Professor Khalid Kadir, the late Professor Khalid Kadir, who was a professor of clinical medicine in our school and one of the pioneers of our School of Medicine in this Monash University, Malaysia, and Professor Anwar in the old days, and some of my contemporaries. We looked at cardiometabolic conditions as well, because we know that it's a big issue now. We know that populations are now transitioning, or rather what we call an epidemiological transition, where in the past it would be problems like parasites or problems like malaria and things like that, more infectious disease. But now we are actually seeing more and more that the non-infectious type of diseases or lifestyle diseases, such as cardiovascular disease, hypercholesterolemia, diabetes, are now coming to the fore for Indigenous communities. So that work was published in BMC Public Health and other types of journals as well. So we see that change in terms of the health and what we need to do now to try and address the health needs of these, and no longer can think, they're just people with malaria and parasites and things like that. We have to also think of them as being part of Malaysian population, which they always have been. It's just that they escape the notice of people. God only knows why. Maybe not many people know enough about them, but we need to put them into our national health agenda and address things that we would address with somebody in Kuala Lumpur, right? To prevent non-communicable diseases.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting. As I said, I'm learning so much about the journey from you right now as well. So moving on to the next question. Do you have any current projects you are excited about locally and internationally?
Yes, actually I do. There is a international project that we have been working for the longest time on, and it has been delayed because of the COVID. And this is a project that I'm doing together with my collaborators in Stanford, the US, in Oxford, in Mexico, Sinistaf, and a few other places, where we are trying now to understand the migrations and population genetics of the Pacific people. So when we talk about Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, what happened, right? So it's a continuation of our story, in a sense, from Southeast Asia and the islands now to what happened in the Pacific. And that is a project that is hopefully now we have a somewhat of a decent manuscript, and we started this in 2016-17. It's now 2023, and as I mentioned, a lot of things happened during COVID. Laboratories had to change from population genetics labs to testing for viruses and things like that, so you have things that happen along the way. But that's an interesting project, and hopefully we will be able to publish and share with the global community and the academic community what happened with population of the Pacific. I won't say anything now, but potentially interesting. A second thing that we're doing on a local level, and I mentioned, is an engagement project that I'm doing in collaboration with Dr. Mark Balnavis from the School of Arts and Social Sciences. And this is an engagement project because we find, or rather we think, that it's sometimes important to engage with the public. When scientists and specialists do papers, it is a smaller community of people who are similar-minded, academia, right? And academia is not everybody in the public sphere. It is subsection of people. Oftentimes it's not very large either. So our discoveries and our engagements and the knowledge, it does not get down to the public level. So we embarked upon this project, which is very well supported with a small grant from Monash University, Malaysia. And I would like to thank my head of schools for supporting, and also Professor Matthew Nicholson, who is supporting us to do a project called Muhiba. So Muhiba means in Bahasa racial harmony, right? And this is a project where we went to engage populations or communities in Sarawak. We start with Sarawak, and later on we might bring it to Peninsula to talk about their life stories. So we've done the genetics for some of these communities, for example, the Bidayo. But during the time when I was doing this research, there was no time to sit with people and ask them stories about their lives. Right, and that means a lot. Family means a lot. Stories mean a lot. So with Professor Dr. Mark Balnavis, who is a media expert, we thought it's a sort of a good mix of people, and we've engaged partners in this engagement project, and our partners are Dr. Tim Jinam, who's back in UNIMAS, so it's like sometimes like full circle. There is Mr. Brandon Ritom, who is an artist of Bidayo descent, and we've engaged Ensera Creatives, which is a production company for videography and all sorts of things, and Mr. Joe Siddiq, JS Productions. Joe is very well versed. If you Google Joe Siddiq, the huge profile will come up. Events planner, extraordinary, talented person that does these festivals and things like that. So this project is telling stories. This project is looking at communities and looking at transition in generations. And we just came back from Sarawak in June, and we're putting together some video footage. We've got drone footage, and we've even got a 3-dimensional mapping of the Panga, which is where they place the skulls. Because in the early days, of course, the Iban and some tribes in Sarawak were headhunters. We are known as headhunting place with the tattoos and everything. So now it's the people who have converted to Christianity. Of course, headhunting is now has been banned for a long time. If not, we wouldn't go there. But I think it's something that we can offer a wider community and share with everybody. Yeah. Still ongoing. Yeah.
I think everyone would be kind of interested to know what the future holds and what type of projects will be out in the near future. So that was a lovely and interesting conversation that I had with you today, Professor. And that would be the end of today's podcast as well. So I would like to thank Professor Maude. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor. And this was really an interesting chat. And I hope our listeners would have learned something new as well.
Thank you very much for having me, and let's wish all of us the best for EDI week.